Ferrari seemed to be on top of absolutely everything this weekend at Monza, that is until Sunday. After the race, I had a couple of pretty big questions, starting with, did Ferrari achieve the maximum available this weekend, or did they leave some points on the table? There have been a couple of suggestions that the Ferrari pit wall didn't optimize this race or manage their drivers properly, and there have been even other suggestions saying that Leclerc or Sainz cost the team more points or even the race win. So let's walk through the data and try to understand first what happened during the race, and then what could have happened for Ferrari, Leclerc, and Sainz. But before we get to Sunday, we need to set the stage. Monza is the lowest downforce circuit on the calendar. Almost every year, teams will develop an ultra-low drag, low downforce, slippy rear wing to generate the top speeds necessary to compete at Monza. Red Bull, having a relatively efficient low drag car already, didn't go for a full rear wing assembly. They've only trimmed the rear wing flap in order to reduce the drag a little bit. And then you've got Ferrari. They decided to go for an ultra low downforce bespoke rear wing package for this weekend. And honestly, it's no spoiler that I think it worked out pretty well.
Carlos Sainz takes pole position!
Ferrari were on form all weekend, pretty much topping the timesheets of every session, and then Carlos Sainz putting the car on pole with a pretty spectacular qualifying lap. He'd be starting the race just ahead of Max Verstappen in P2, and then Charles Leclerc would be starting the race in P3. But when I went back to look through the qualifying data, I was convinced that this ultra low drag rear wing was absolutely the correct play for Ferrari. However, it might have had some consequences come Sunday. So let's look at those cracks that were already starting to show on Saturday and see what they mean for the race. Like I said, Sainz's lap in qualifying was pretty spectacular. For his final lap in qualifying, he's got good track position and he has a slight toe from the car ahead of him, which honestly gives him the edge over his teammate who didn't really have much of a toe. But on Saturday, when I was looking through Max versus Carlos's qualifying laps, I already started to see that I thought the Ferrari might struggle on Sunday. Now here's Sainz versus Verstappen in their fastest qualifying laps on Saturday. Now, this is Sainz in blue and Verstappen in red. Yes, I know this is backwards, but I always put the faster car in blue, and this is completely messing with my OCD. Now, talking through this lap, you can see that Sainz clearly has the straight line speed advantage. Here's the top speeds down all the straights, and you can see that Sainz probably has about 5 to 6 kilometers an hour at the very end of these straights. And if you look at the time delta, you can see that Sainz is gaining lap time on all these straight line segments. But you can also see that Verstappen, in terms of time gained, is gaining time through most of the cornering segments. And this is the classic low downforce versus higher downforce configuration. I know we're both on the low downforce, but Ferrari with a little bit less drag and downforce, they're faster on the straights and slower through most of the corners. That being said, Sainz has 2 critical points in his laps that we need to point out. The first of these instances is at turn 4 or 5. Now, Verstappen's on slightly more downforce. He should be faster through the corners, but Sainz finds about 1/10 of a second here, and he's just able to carry that much more speed in on the brakes and then also not lose anything on the exit. I expected Max to be faster there, but Carlos absolutely nailed that in his qualifying lap. And to be fair, Sainz is pretty much faster than every other driver through this corner in qualifying 3. Now, the second critical point in Sainz's lap is how much time he loses through turn 11. You can see he's got superior straight line speed down to the braking zone, but he tends to brake a little bit earlier and overslow the car quite a bit. And that lost him 1/10 of a second. So whatever he's gained earlier in the lap, he's lost most of that in this final corner, and that could have cost him pole, but it was just enough. But there is one more thing that's super important that I noticed in this, and this is going to be super critical for Sunday, and maybe some of you spotted it already. Relative to Verstappen, Sainz is struggling quite a bit with traction. You can see that it takes him a little bit longer to get full throttle in all of these traction zones. On one hand, this is a product of lower downforce, but it could also be related to car handling issues or just inherent car characteristics that wouldn't necessarily be completely solved with more downforce. And the thing that stood out to me is in the Ascari chicane, so turn 8, 9, 10, you can see Sainz goes on throttle and then has a lot of hesitation here going full throttle. Again, yes, he had the issue in turn 11, but he's still super hesitant squeezing the throttle all the way down on turn 11. And that to me looks like an inherent traction issue. Looking at Leclerc's lap, this was the exact same thing for him. So I'm thinking Ferrari might have a little bit of a struggle with traction come Sunday. Now, in qualifying, you can deal with minor traction issues, especially when you've got the front wing cranked all the way up and you're trying to extract every single last bit of grip out of the tires. But if you still have those issues on Sunday, it can definitely come back to bite you. Honestly, I think the low downforce configuration was Ferrari's best bet for this weekend. I don't think the car is entirely sorted in terms of its overall balance, even at a high and medium downforce circuit, but in terms of competitiveness, this is one of the best Ferraris that we've seen in a while. So far up through qualifying, it looks like Ferrari have made all the right decisions, but on Sunday, does that change? Well, let's look through the race and try to pick it apart. After a few formation laps due to the Tsunoda engine failure, the race finally starts. The race start and lap 1 is pretty uneventful for Monza standards, and it doesn't really start to heat up until Max starts putting pressure on Carlos. So let's see what that looks like. So this is our race gaps chart, and it shows us the distance between cars on a given lap for each of these drivers, and I've highlighted Sainz, Verstappen, Leclerc, and Perez. You can see at the start of the race, Verstappen closing up to Sainz and finally starting to put pressure on him, and around lap 15, Max overtakes Sainz. I mean, 15 laps is a pretty long time to be defending, and the fact that it took that long for Verstappen to get past Sainz tells me that Ferrari were probably in the right window in terms of their downforce and drag, at least as far as the overall competitive order. And as far as overtaking attempts into turn 1, most of the early shots were of Max around the outside into turn 1, and unless you're ahead at the apex of turn 1, you're getting the door shut and getting forced wide or having to drive over the curb. Eventually, Max gets the inside into turn 1 and takes the lead. So Sainz defended this insanely well, but Verstappen really didn't give him any room to breathe, and this is where it starts to get tricky. Once overtaken by Verstappen, Sainz starts to fall back massively. Realistically, he needs to box as soon as possible. Leclerc is effectively stuck behind Sainz with fresher tires and unable to do anything with them at all. So they both end up losing time and falling back towards Perez, who has just overtaken Russell. Eventually, Sainz boxes here, and then Leclerc boxes a lap later. When watching this live, my immediate reaction was they should have let Leclerc pass, but they didn't. Speaking of, if you've ever wanted to hang out and watch a Formula 1 race and talk about what's happening live, I've been hosting watch-alongs here on YouTube streams for qualifying in the race pretty much every weekend. So if you're not already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and come say hello next time you see us live. Now, I'll come back to the end of this first stint. This is the bit that we need to analyze, but we really need to look at the rest of the race to finish building up the picture. So this is the second stint of the race, and Verstappen has pit and checked out. He's holding about a 5-second gap or more for the rest of the race. Now, stint 2 starts with Sainz, Leclerc, and Perez in a bit of a train. Perez puts pressure on Leclerc for the first 10 laps or so, and then he moves on to Sainz. And realistically, at this point of the race, Verstappen probably managing his pace a little bit, but Sainz's pace is very strong. But you can see here around lap 40, as soon as Perez closes the gap to Sainz and start to put pressure on him, he loses so much lap time. In a period of 5 or 6 laps, Sainz has completely burned up his tires and again falls off back into Leclerc. Sainz asks the team just to make sure they can bring it home, and Leclerc does have a couple looks, but no massive risks, just a couple of lockups. Some of it was pretty close, but honestly, it was exciting. I enjoyed it. But I still think there could have been more for Ferrari at Monza, so let's take a step back with a little bit of hindsight, and let's talk about 2 theories that have been going around. Let's start with theory 1, which is somehow that if Leclerc hadn't been so selfish and had helped more, Ferrari could have won the Italian Grand Prix. Now, this theory is based on the idea that if Leclerc had put more pressure on Verstappen early in the race, Sainz could have benefited from that and pulled a little bit of a gap and possibly had enough margin to win the race. Now, this was not one of my theories, but let's talk through it and see what we think. Now, we're back here on the first stint, and we've got Leclerc, Verstappen, and Sainz. And truth be told, Leclerc looks like he's looking after his tires in this stint. He's keeping just over a 1.5-second gap in a lot of places. I honestly think this was the smartest thing he could have done. He still had some pace in hand once Sainz's tires had burned up. But let's say that Leclerc starts putting pressure on Verstappen immediately. Would Verstappen have been able to push as hard on Sainz? Probably not. Would that have helped Sainz out? Probably yes. But looking at the Red Bull, after attacking for nearly 15 laps, Verstappen still has so much pace in hand. So I really feel like the Red Bull win was almost inevitable, unless, of course, Verstappen DNF'd. Red Bull was a reasonable chunk faster on Sunday. Leclerc burning up his tires, attacking Verstappen, probably would have put him in the same position as Sainz at this point, and potentially Perez could have undercut them at the first stop instead of coming out behind them, so that likely would have still been a Ferrari 3-4. So did Leclerc being passive, looking after himself in the first stint, cost Ferrari the win? I really don't think so. Again, unless Verstappen DNFs. But there's another theory. Like I said before, my initial impression was that the Ferrari pit wall should have let Leclerc past. Sainz had burned up his tires and all he had done was push both of them back into Perez, removing any chance that they could hang on to Verstappen at the front of the race. So let's look at the data, and if you like this kind of data analysis, you should definitely check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. After every qualifying and race, I post a detailed report about what happened with exactly these kind of topics and a lot more details for more teams than just the race winners. So let's look at theory 2, which is the what happens if you let Leclerc past. For sure, at the start of the race, Leclerc was managing his tires and not getting too close to Verstappen. I don't think Leclerc thought that he could overtake Max, so he said, you know what, I'll just bide my time and wait. And then as soon as Sainz has burned up his tires, he falls back probably a lot more spectacularly than they expected. But look at how much time they lose relative to Verstappen by getting stuck behind Sainz and getting pushed back. The gap here goes from maybe 1.5 seconds to over 5 seconds. Realistically, if Sainz had let Leclerc through, I really think that he could have stayed within 2 seconds until this stint and then possibly boxed on the same lap as Verstappen. Now, the reason they didn't pit Sainz as soon as he got overtaken and fell off massively is if you look at the pit stop gap, he would have fallen out right here by Bottas, but even looking at this pace now, he's about the same pace as Bottas, so that was a risk at any point anyway, and he only comes out right ahead of him. So let's go back to that other idea and imagine that Leclerc can hold this gap to Verstappen. He would then pit here, and he would come out 1 or 2 seconds behind Verstappen. Now, in this case, Sainz would have had to defend to Perez and maybe bought Leclerc some time, so he's probably going to be somewhere around here. With 30 laps and a marginally faster race car here, for sure Perez is coming through one and or both of the Ferraris in any case. But I genuinely think it's possible that Leclerc could have held on to the P2 spot if he had been let through and come out behind Verstappen on the second stint. Now, why do I think Leclerc was faster this weekend? So on the in laps here, Leclerc is still 0.7 faster than Sainz. Clearly, this is Sainz holding him up. He has tires left, but at this point, the strategy dictates he needs to stop. The other thing is, looking at this, when Leclerc is defending to Perez, Perez eventually gets through, but Leclerc is able to hold on. Now, as soon as Perez gets onto Sainz, he loses so much pace. You can see how they're closing, following Verstappen here, and then once Sainz is on him, he falls away, and then once he gets overtaken, he loses so much pace again, and Leclerc has no option. It just looks like relatively Sainz loses a lot more time defending than Leclerc does. So if Leclerc had been given the wave through, I think Ferrari possibly looking at a 2nd and 4th instead of a 3rd and a 4th. At the end of the race, the team principal Frederic Vasseur said he was happy for them to race without taking risk, and he enjoyed seeing this. But to me, the goal should be to maximize the team's points, especially if a race win isn't on the cards, and mathematically the race win would have looked even better. Ferrari are 3rd in the Constructors' Championship, only 45 points behind Mercedes. The difference between finishing 2nd and 4th and 3rd and 4th is only 3 points, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but there are 8 races left this season. Honestly, for the race, I was entertained and I feel like Ferrari did a good job, but not messing up is not the same as optimizing the race result. And I really wonder if Ferrari are having this communication internally, but I genuinely think that the better race for Ferrari this weekend was to let Leclerc through, play a little bit of favoritism or some team orders in order to get more points. I don't feel like the team principal should be worried about the entertainment factor. You can't pay people in vibes. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and be sure to check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description below, and I'll see you guys soon.